It's Phil Halper from the SkydivePhil YouTube channel, and I'm hijacking Doubts Aloud to talk about animal suffering and why it's probably the biggest problem theism faces.
Wow. Do you know, this keeps happening, doesn't it, Francis and Ed? Every time I try to do an intro, someone new comes on the podcast and hijacks us. But yes, okay, we've got Phil Halper today. And Ed, can you tell us all about Phil?
Well, Phil is much better known as SkydivePhil, and you have been, Phil, on the show with Justin, the Unbelievable Show, quite a few times.
Oh, yeah. I think it's, let me think, 4 times, yeah.
Yeah, mostly on cosmology and that kind of issue with Jeff
Swearing. Jeff Swearing,
Yeah.
I've been on with him twice, yeah.
Yeah.
So we're
Lovely
all mutual
guy,
fan clubs for Unbelievable. We've all been on so many times now.
Yeah.
That's right.
And you're in our
Yeah.
group, our discussion group, Phil.
That's right. That's great.
Number
fun.
of-
I like
number
that.
of
I
years
like
now.
doing that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So have you been on with animal suffering on the Unbelievable Show?
Yeah, that was the first time I was on, actually.
Oh, right.
Yeah, I debated Michael Murray, who, for those that don't know who he is, he used to be, I think it was executive director of programs at the Templeton Foundation, and that is a very wealthy organization that has been alleged to spend lots of money trying to promote the idea that religion and science are somehow, perfectly aligned with one another. And it's quite a controversial organization. Sean Carroll has written about this. But
Right.
he wrote a book called Nature, Red in Tooth and Claw, which tries to tackle this problem of animal suffering. And William Lane Craig famously used one of his arguments in a debate, and things spiraled out of control from there. We can go a bit more into detail about that if you wish.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Interested to hear that.
Yeah. Well, you've done a paper which we're going to get onto, which I guess is the kind of background to why you're our guest now. But let's go back to the beginning, and maybe this did come up when William Lane Craig was in Britain, and they had the famous empty chair in the Oxford.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, this actually happened not on that debate. It was on that tour, but not on that debate. It was actually, I was at this debate. So what happened was, let's give the audience a bit of background here. So basically, Stephen Law made his evil God argument. And the argument is, if people don't know it, there's too many nice things in the world, rainbows and kittens and things like that, for you to believe as an all-powerful evil God. And by the same token, you shouldn't believe as an all-powerful good God, because there's too many horrible things in the world. And the example that Law gave was how the Komodo dragon kills its prey. It's very slow. And Bill Craig came back and said, well, animals aren't aware that they are in pain. So, and he gave this sort of pseudoscience argument that was actually slightly misquoted from Michael Murray. But basically he said, well, animals don't have a prefrontal cortex, and you need that to be self-aware. So if you don't have self-awareness, you're not aware that you're in pain. And therefore, you can fight back against this argument. And I was in the audience of that debate. And I have to say, I immediately thought this is nonsense. Not because I knew anything about what a prefrontal cortex did or didn't, but because I'd volunteered at Dolphin Research Intelligence Project in Hawaii. And I knew they'd passed sort of several tests for self-awareness. So I thought this statement that only humans and other great apes were the only ones to have self-awareness was obviously wrong. So I decided to make a video. I ended up interviewing lots of scientists who were experts in this, including some of the very, very top people in the field. And they all just said, this is nonsense. And we made a video debunking it. And that went out. And then Bill Craig did a half-hour podcast replying. And I have to say, I was somewhat nervous when I found this out, because I thought, wow, half-hour of material attacking me. What mistakes did I make? But when I listened to it, it was one fabulous relief, because every point that he made was ludicrous and easily replied to. So we did a reply. And then Michael Murray, who's kind of Bill's source author in some sense, did a written reply on Bill's podcast, on his website. He put a few questions of the week up as well, William Lane Craig, one of which has sneakily been deleted because I think, well, I don't know why, but maybe it's a reasonable guess to say, because it had so much nonsense in it. But anyway, so then I ended up debating Michael Murray on The Unbelievable Show. And in preparation for that, I contacted some scientists who had done a very, very interesting study. We'll come on to that in a moment. And I wanted to sort of make sure I was getting all my scientific facts right. So I had contacted the authors of these studies, and they were fascinated by what I was telling them, what my motivation was. And they said, we should write a paper to sort of, make this more formal. And so we did. It took years and years to write. And then it took years of peer review because the editorial board changed at the journal. So, but finally it's out.
Sorry, what did the editorial board do?
Oh, well, I think two of the editors had to resign. It just meant that things took a lot longer than
Okay, so there's nothing funny going on. It was just life.
Well, there were issues about one paper they published, whether they should have, and it's not worth going into that, in my opinion.
Okay.
It just meant that our paper took forever to get reviewed.
Could we just go back? I know that Ed, you're sort of asking Phil to go back to the beginning, but could we go back before the beginning in terms of the implications of for this podcast, the theology? For the sake of the audience, what is the equation between animal suffering and any form of theology or theodicy?
Right. So what we could do, so we've written the scientific paper, but we are planning to follow it up with a sort of more theological, philosophical one. And the idea is that there are a lot of problems for Christian theology in particular, although I think it's also true for Judaism as well, Islam probably, but I think particular Christianity, because they really focus on the fall. And the first problem of animal suffering is that if you think pain and suffering came into the world because of the fall, well, animals have been suffering for hundreds of millions of years before the fall. So that is going to give you a huge problem. So it's one thing for certain liberal Christians to say, yeah, we accept evolution and the dating of the earth and so on and so forth. But that comes at an enormous cost. And that enormous cost is you've now got to explain why there was so much animal suffering before the fall. And that's the traditional problem of animal suffering. But we think it's worse than that, because on top of that, you also have the fact that the nature of the way humans got here through evolution, through catastrophe, like the dinosaur impact, that mechanism is extremely violent. So if you say that God chose those mechanisms, you have to ask, why did he choose mechanisms that involved such enormous amounts of animal suffering? So that's sort of problem number two. Problem number three is all the animal suffering that God commands in the Bible. So a lot of atheists, of course, are always mentioning the Canaanite slaughter, but they very rarely mention the fact that it's not just the humans that are slaughtered or commanded to be slaughtered, but also their animals. So that's an additional problem. And then another additional problem is that God doesn't just command this stuff. He does it. In the Great Flood or in the 10 plagues, he's also killing lots of animals. That seems to be somewhat cruel. And then what I would say is probably the last problem is that, God commanded us all to eat meat. And why? We're having now a mass extinction event, it looks like, potentially. And it could so easily have been avoided if God just made us all vegetarians, but he didn't. So all of these five
You also
problems...
missed out the sacrificial system of animals all the way through the Old Testament.
Yeah, well, I probably would bracket that under the cruelty to animals that God
Right. Okay.
does.
So that's part of the
I would just have
animals.
that as an example.
Ritual killing of them. Yeah.
I mean, all of these things can just so easily be explained by the fact there is no biblical God. But if you believe there is, then you've got a lot of problems. You've got a lot of explaining to do.
Yes.
It's interesting that the famous Roe, William Roe, with his argument, it was an animal dying in the forest. That's
right, Bambi.
Oh, right.
No, it's literally known as Bambi.
Oh, right. Okay.
It's a fawn. I think he imagines there's a lightning strike, and then there's a forest fire, and this fawn dies in the forest, and he's basically saying, there's no theodicy that can explain that. But that's a hypothetical example. When I've given talks, I use a real example, one we know definitely happened. So the example I like to give is what's called a predator trap. So the idea is, animals get stuck in
I think you mentioned this in the group.
Yeah,
in London. I was really struck by this. So yeah, carry on.
Think of it this way: animal get stuck in a sort of tar type material, and then a predator notices, oh well, that's an easy meal. This animal can't move, so they go in and they get stuck too. And the La Brea tar pits in California, there's the remains of like 4,000 direwolves that died this way, and that is going to be very, very hard to explain with a theodicy. So yeah, and that's a real example. The one that Rowe came up with is imagined, but this is one we actually have the fossil record of.
But even wouldn't Phil, people have come to you like this? Like I would mention, of course, you're like young Earth creationists would love you basically for saying all of this against the general theistic evolution. But actually, isn't the other way around? Even post fall, to have all that scenario with animals anyway from the fall. How have you found that challenge?
Well, the young Earth creationism does solve one of the problems, which is the hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering. So yes, solved if you don't believe there is hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering.
Yeah.
Okay, but then you still have take the flood.
Yeah.
God seems to give us his reason why he gave the flood. It's because humans were sinful. So why did he kill all the animals? So that's not solved by young Earth creationism. And also, why did he do it so slowly? I mean, 40 days and nights. Not every animal would die so quickly. I mean, the animals in the water would have died slowly as the salination, presumably the salt content of the water would change, and freshwater animals would, die slowly. So,
what about whales and dolphins? Would it?
Yeah, I think they would be in a problem because, well, their food sources would dry up.
Oh, that's true.
Because the salinity of the water would change. That's my understanding of it, anyway. But even those on the land, even if you forget them, why did all they have to die?
I've heard New Age, young Earth creationists talking about lions eating straw and that sort of thing before Adam and Eve sinned. And,
right. That's certainly...
And so it was all this beautiful world where even lions, for some reason, even though they're designed as predators, weren't eating meat. And then God decided to punish the animal kingdom for the sin of Adam and Eve, which also hasn't been easily explained.
Right. I mean, I'm not sure they all think that he punished him. I think some would say that it broke the world.
Yes, sorry, that would, that's a
right. But then the question is, why is the design of the world so fragile, so lacking in any redundant? I mean, I like jumping out of airplanes. You probably guessed that. We have two parachutes. It's called redundancy in design. You have a backup. So the question is, why is there no redundancy in the design if it's so fragile that the mistake of one or two beings can lead such a horrible fate for all the others? It just seems...
Yeah, it does. I mean, my question, Phil, would be like in a fall anyway. I always thought this, even when I was young, I was thinking, how can a fall create, in some senses, the wonder of the food chain, which actually seems an amazing design, if not cruel. Do you see what I mean? Sort of like the system of the food chain.
Well, this is one of the other problems. The food chain is very cruel. So if you think God is responsible for that, you have to ask, why couldn't he just have made us all vegetarians? Why couldn't we just have like solar panels or something? Like absorb energy from the sun. That wouldn't involve anyone eating anybody else. Why did the mechanism of our survival involve such violence?
And if it's part of God withdrawing and it does it by itself, you've got sort of a mindless form of evolution that actually does a sort of a wonderful thing of the food chain. That's the point I'm making. I mean, it's not nice and it is horrific, but it is actually amazing in itself. The food chain, everything balancing, eating each other.
It's amazing from the perspective of design, as long as you have to start worrying about the morality of it all.
Yes, I mean, but it's no design though, isn't it? God looks the other way and the world does this.
I mean, if you're a deist, you're not troubled by these arguments.
No.
For a theist who thinks that the creator is perfectly moral, then you're going to have a problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So whichever way we look at it, we got problems then, really, is what you're saying.
Yes, but the suffering is designed in.
It's part of the very engine of our creation. This is the problem. So even if you ignore the flood and the things like that, it's the mechanism of how we got here.
Yeah.
Why would a creator create such a violent mechanism?
Mm.
Yeah, you sound like Ken Ham. So you sound just like Ken Ham.
Yes, but Ken Ham would still have to say that a lion is designed by God with all its teeth and speed and claws and the rest of it.
I'd have to look at that. I'm sure he would have to say something like that. He'd probably say the teeth were meant for, I don't know, playing about with tree bark or something. But then people who love trees would have a problem with that.
Well, trees definitely don't have a frontal cortex. So,
yes.
we can
And yet
probably...
God said in one of the passages, kill everybody, man, women, children, animals, but please don't chop down the trees. And it says something like, for what are they? Humans? Which is actually an amazing thing for God to say, which is like the trees are really valuable, but humans aren't.
Yeah.
I think it's in Joshua. I think it is.
This is one of the problems that when you ask some of these people, and we should probably talk about this stuff about the prefrontal cortex. We should get on to that. But before we do, these people that advocate that animals don't really suffer are known as neo-Cartesians. And when you ask them, but then are you implying that we can treat animals however we like, in the way that so the followers of Descartes are said to have done? They will say, no, we're not advocating violence to animals because we are stewards of God's creation and we have a duty of care to it. But then that would imply that what's the difference between cutting the limbs off a tree and cutting the limbs off a pear?
I mean, I when I was at that debate with Stephen Law, and I heard William Lane Craig say that, I just thought, well, goodness, does that mean that his own pets, because he said he loved animals, so I assume he's got pets, that his own pets, he would ask the vet to conduct operations on them unanesthetized?
Well,
because an anesthetic carries a risk to the animal. It always carries a risk. Right. So are you saying that the best way to conduct your stewardship of that animal would be to say, oh, no, don't give them any anesthetic, just sort of...
I bet he wouldn't do that.
Cut their balls off, while they're still conscious,
I bet he wouldn't do that. It would be...
Well, that's what I thought. I cannot believe that he would
here's
do
an
that.
interesting fact about Bill Craig's pet. He had, now if I remember rightly, he had a cat called Mr. Muff, or Muff. No, sorry, Muff. Or Muffy, something like that. Anyway, he wrote on his website that when it was old and, dying, getting ill, shall we say, of age-related diseases, he had the cat put down. And he said it was one of the most difficult decisions he'd ever made. Now, we have to ask, why did he have the cat put down? Presumably, it's because it was at the end of its life, it was suffering, and it was to relieve its suffering. And it was a humane thing to do, would be the argument. But if you don't believe it's aware of its own pain, then why did you have it put down?
Yeah, I mean, I always say, if you want to know what somebody really believes, don't listen to what they say, watch what they do. And if what they do is not consistent with what they say, then they are not telling you what they really believe.
Yeah. Okay, so can we just quickly assume that William Lane Craig's right in when he says that they feel pain, but they're not aware of their pain? Is that how you put it?
Well, why don't I give you the direct quote and we can go from there. How about that? Let me just pull it up. Give me a sec. Okay. So he basically said that there's this sort of threefold hierarchy of pain. And I'm going to, right, here, so let's start the quote. On the most fundamental level, there's simply the reaction to stimuli, such as an amoeba exhibits when you poke it with a needle. It doesn't really feel pain. There's a second level of pain awareness, which sentient animals have, which is an experience of pain. And animals like horses, dogs, and cats would experience this second level pain awareness, but they do not experience a third level pain awareness, which is the awareness of second order pain. That is the awareness that one is oneself in pain. For that sort of pain awareness requires self-awareness. And this is centered in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, a section of the brain that is missing in all animals except for the higher primates and human beings. And therefore, even though animals are in pain, they aren't aware of it. They don't have this third order pain awareness. They are not aware of pain, and therefore They do not suffer as human beings do. Now, this is tremendous comfort to those of us who are animal lovers like myself, or to pet owners. Even though your dog or your cat may be in pain, it really isn't aware of being in pain, and therefore it doesn't suffer as you would when you are in pain. So that's the quote.
Okay, great.
So shall we try and dissect it a bit?
Well,
I mean, sorry.
What I'd like to at some stage is to assume he's correct, and then see what's left of the argument, because I think there still would be plenty left of your argument, even if we accept he's correct.
Right. Okay. So let's assume that well, the problem is, can he even be correct? Is what he's saying even coherent? So there's a problem.
Yeah. Well, there is that, but
because so if I say can I even say that he's correct? Because if what he's saying is literally incoherent, then it's sort of impossible to say it's correct. And I would argue that it is sort of incoherent. But I think what he's trying to say, let's be a bit charitable and say, that there's some sort of metacognition needed for suffering. I mean, there's another quote, actually. And I'm going to read this quote out because I think it is very relevant. Let's see if I can quickly find it in my notes here. All right, here we go. So, all right, so I'll start the quote now. All animals but the great apes and man lack the neural pathways associated with level 3 pain awareness. Being a very late evolutionary development, this pathway is not present throughout the animal world. What that implies is that throughout the almost entirety of long history of evolutionary development, no creature was ever aware of being in pain. Viewed theologically, this discovery magnifies the mercy and goodness of God. God has shielded almost the entire animal kingdom throughout its history from an awareness of being in pain. All right, I'll stop the quote there. Right. So now the point is, if this argument is going to work at all, he's got to push back against this argument from animal suffering. So we've got to say that their suffering is either non-existent or at least so little that it's not morally salient. And that's the problem, because, if he's right, if you can do that, if you can establish there's no morally salient animal suffering, then he can push back against this argument. But it's very hard to do that and stay consistent, because when we started pushing back and lots of people started writing into him and saying, how could you say that animals don't suffer? He then starts saying, oh, no, we're not saying they don't suffer. But then, what do you mean when you say they're not aware of their suffering? Because if you are suffering is an emotion. You can have like cognitive things going on and various things going on in your body. Like, you might not be aware of certain subsystems in your body, but you can't not be aware of an emotion. So I would say it's incoherent to say you're unaware of your own suffering. And the whole thing is incoherent, because notice that level 1 pain awareness is, and I'll start again, simply the reaction to stimuli such as amoeba exhibits when you poke it with a needle. It doesn't really feel pain. Now, how can it be coherent to say level 1 pain awareness is not feeling pain? Then that's not
more
pain
like
awareness.
So it's more like level 1 pain reaction.
Yeah, it's basically saying, aversive reaction.
Yes, yeah.
In the literature, this threefold hierarchy is not something that is, discussed in the scientific literature. This is, their own invention. I mean, but they do, what is discussed in scientific literature is a difference between what's called aversive reaction or reaction to a stimuli and what's called affect. So affect is like the word effect, but with an A at the beginning. And affect is the emotional component of pain. So when what scientists do distinguish is that there's just sort of nociception, which is a sort of reaction, and affect. So that is a meaningful distinction. But if you're saying they don't have any affect, then they can't have any suffering, So if they either do or don't have affect, or they might have it to various degrees, of course. You could argue they have it at some low level, but this idea that you need some sort of metacognition to feel pain seems ludicrous.
I mean, my response to the William Lane Craig, or that line of talking is, it seems to me that if you're going to go down that route, then don't you equally have a problem with all suffering apart from your own? Because it seems to me that, for instance, you might tell me, wow, that hurt, but I don't know on William Lane Craig's version of the approach to things. I don't know that when you say that, you are meaning that you have the same terrible experience that I have when I talk about pain. If you're going to completely divorce this from what we instinctively recognize as pain behavior, which is, crying and, contortions, strong aversive reaction. If you're going to say, oh, well, that's neither here nor there, we don't need to read too much into that, then you shouldn't read it into any other person apart from yourself. It's complete solipsistic version of the world.
Absolutely. So basically, I mentioned that we were writing a follow-up paper to our scientific paper. And one of the things I'd like to address is there's been another sort of neo-Cartesian published since we submitted our paper. And that's a guy called Callum Miller. I don't know if you know him.
Oh, yes. He's been on Unbelievable as well, hasn't he?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, so. I mean, he's pretty good. He's pretty bright.
He's
So basically, he's basically making the argument that not that animals don't feel pain, but rather that we can't know that they feel pain because, we'll go into why in a second, but and therefore we can't, us atheists can't run this argument because we're just not epistemically justified in saying that animals feel pain. We just can't prove it. And he basically says stuff like, well, behavior could mislead you. We can't ask the animals. There are problems with looking at their anatomy and saying there are similarities. So we just can't know whether they're in pain. And in fact, when I was on the show with Michael Murray, he sort of backed off what he'd written in print, which is, we do have evidence that they're not in pain, to, well, we just don't know, whether they're in pain. We just can't tell. And yeah, you're absolutely right, Francis, that why don't you just apply the same thing to other people? Like, you might say, well, I can ask other people, they can tell me they're in pain. I can't ask an animal, but I can't ask someone actually if they speak a different language to me, or certainly before Google Translate. I can't ask a 1-year-old child that can't talk, and also, even if I do ask them, well, these people would say, behavior can be deceptive, but language can also be deceptive. Someone could say that they're in pain when they're not, to elicit sympathy, and they could say they're not in pain when they are, to project strength. So, if behavior can deceive us, so can language. So you're absolutely right. If you follow this line of argument, you're led to solipsism. Absolutely.
And babies, I think you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, this is a problem because, and also, Craig wants to say the prefrontal cortex is essential for self-awareness, and that's essential for therefore the awareness of pain. But the prefrontal cortex takes a very long time to develop. I mean, it's developing all the way through adolescence. So a young child of a year old has virtually no prefrontal cortex. So presumably then, it leads you to the conclusion then young children don't suffer either.
Well, we know they do, in that the damage done to a young child can usually can lead to lifelong suffering or a damage.
Well, that's physical damage, though, Ed. I mean, if you're a neo-Cartesian, you could say, but I don't know that they experienced that suffering when that damage was done. I mean, you could have damage done to you when you're under anesthetic, but that doesn't mean you experience the pain of that event happening.
But what you're saying is nobody actually does think that about babies, or do they?
Correct.
No.
Well, there was actually... There was at least one neo-Cartesian. There's a guy called Bob Berman who does say this, and I think also Peter Carruthers, who's a philosopher, I think, I have to go off my memory here, makes this claim, that young children don't suffer.
Oh my gosh.
And in fact, what's ironic is that Michael Murray, who was Bill Craig's source, actually quoted Bob Berman as sort of making this link to the prefrontal cortex, But Murray, I think, just made a mistake, because what Bob Berman was saying was, and to my knowledge, Bob Berman, I have no knowledge of him having any religious motivation for this. So, or they might have, I don't know. But Bob Berman was saying, well, it's the enlarged prefrontal cortex of humans that gives you this self-awareness that you need. Murray just made a mistake, I think, and said, well, it's the prefrontal cortex. But, obviously that's just wrong, because the prefrontal cortex is present in lots of animals. So but it's particularly large in the human. So Bob Berman's argument, even though I think it's wrong, was slightly better informed than Murray. I think he just made a mistake, quite frankly.
All right. Wow.
But maybe we should talk about why we think the prefrontal cortex is not relevant, and that this whole discussion is a red herring. So,
okay, if you can explain it so I understand it,
for sure.
then believe me, you'll have explained it so that anyone can understand it.
Okay. All right. So
which means
basically, all we have to know is some region of the brain. You don't have to really know anything else, right? And the claim is that this region of the brain is required for self-awareness. And there were some scientists that took this view. So it's not a completely crazy view. Now, what happened was there was a patient called patient R, or well, actually known as Roger as well. And he had his prefrontal cortex completely destroyed. So my co-authors on our scientific paper examined him, and they found his self-awareness was perfectly intact. He can pass every test of self-awareness you can throw at him. He can identify, he can do the mirror test, he can do what's called uncertainty monitoring.
Are you saying you've met him?
I didn't meet him. My colleagues examined him.
Oh.
So there's basically 4 authors on this paper. David Rudralph and Ken Williford examined patient R. The other author, so basically David Rudralph is a neuroscientist. Ken Williford is a philosopher of consciousness. And there's also the other author is Perry Fuchs, who's a pain specialist.
Yeah. And has Roger been picked over by lots of people?
I don't know about that, but certainly been picked over by these guys.
Yeah.
Whether lots of other people have examined him, I don't know. But there certainly my co-authors have. And in fact, this is how I hooked up with them in the first place, because I thought this blows Bill Craig's argument completely out of the water. Because if this guy's self-awareness is perfectly intact, then it's absolutely falsified the claim that the prefrontal cortex is required for self-awareness. And his self-awareness is perfectly intact. So that's why I contacted these guys in the first place, because I suggested to them that this would have implications for claims about distribution of self-awareness in the animal kingdom, because they never mentioned this in their paper. And they were like, yeah. And I also said, and also pain perception. So what happened since the original paper came out, they then tested Roger's pain perception. And it turned out that he's hyperpathic to pain. So hyperpathic is the term used for being overly sensitive to pain. So that's the complete opposite of what you would expect if Bill Craig's thesis was correct. So this blows their argument completely out of the water. It also blows other arguments out of the water as well. Now, in our paper, we focused mostly on the science, not so much on the philosophy. But in particular, there's a debate as to whether fish feel pain. And a lot of, well, I wouldn't say a lot, some scientists have said, no, they don't, because they don't have these regions of the brain. Whereas Roger doesn't have them either. So if he still feels pain, then their argument is blown out of the water. And he does. So it is.
Wow.
Yeah.
How's that, Francis? Was that easy to follow?
It was. And I've always thought this when I've heard you talking about scientific stuff, Phil, that at the end of listening to you describe something, I feel like, wow, I could be quite good at science if I had the right teacher. I always feel like I understand it after you've explained
it's the way you tell it.
It's actually way above my pay grade, but I do sort of I have been able to come out of shows that you've talked on thinking, yeah, and now I understand it.
Well, thank you. That's very
Phil, could I ask a sideways question on this that brings it back to theology on it? Yeah. Have you found in the people that you debated, and you have talked about this a lot, haven't you, with theists, as it were, mainly Christians, presumably, about the obvious thing that's happening here? It's the presupposition that God is good, this suffering, if it's real, is bad, so we will go anywhere where we can to make it not be like that. And do you think that's what's driving it? That it's clear to you that that's what's driving it? They're not prepared to say God is actually quite a harsh God. He's the sort of God that kills Canaanites, sets people up in hell, creates all the stuff.
There's an interesting quote from C.S. Lewis. Now, C.S. Lewis made this argument as well. I sort of associated with Bill Craig, but it goes back earlier. C.S. Lewis made this argument. Craig's PhD supervisor, John Hick, made this argument as well.
All right.
So it goes back earlier. And there's a great quote from Lewis. And I don't know if I have it in front of me, but I'll just paraphrase it. Basically, he said something like, and it's in the problem of pain. He said, from the conclusion that God is good, we can say that the suffering of animals is an illusion, because a good God would not allow it. You know, they can't learn from it. They don't deserve it. So, and Bill Craig said something very similar. You know, I think I read that out, didn't I? You know, this magnifies the mercy and goodness of God. You know, so now we can just reverse this argument, of course.
Yes.
We can say from the conclusion that animals do suffer, we can say that a good God doesn't exist. Because let them. You know, it's just, there's no justification for it. So the neo-Cartesian view, and in fact, even Malebranche and Descartes were, I believe, motivated by this problem. So Descartes, of course, made the original version of this argument. Now, the original version is slightly different to what's called neo-Cartesianism. So Descartes basically said animals have no feelings at all, no consciousness, they're just machines. Now, the neo-Cartesians are not saying that. In fact, interestingly, I said that when Bill Craig did his podcast responding, I had a big relief because he said such a load of nonsense. One of the nonsensical things he said was, oh, this isn't neo-Cartesianism. They're not even using the right terminology, because Descartes viewed animals as being completely devoid of consciousness. So it's not a Cartesian argument. But of course, Bill Craig doesn't know what word neo means. Neo means a new version. And in fact, Murray himself, who he's quoting, describes it as neo-Cartesianism. So I mean, so the idea of neo is that they're saying that animals do have a consciousness, but they don't feel pain. So you could feel lots of things, but not pain, you know. So the motivation for Descartes, for all these people, is clearly the theology. They need this. They need it. Because if you don't have this, then what else are you going to have? I mean, there are other alternatives. I mean, don't get me wrong, there have been other people who have come up with other ways to try and get around this. But this, I don't think they work. This argument would work if it were true.
It seems to me that it's another variant on exactly the same thing in another subject, which is like slavery in the Bible. Oh, well, okay, well, there's not real slavery. Oh, suffering in animals. It's not real suffering. You know, it does seem to be a similar theme here to defend something. I've got one book, by the way, of this Christian guy, very liberal, and he actually goes the other way. And he says, perhaps God is like we read in the Bible, and he does do this sort of thing, you know, and it's a horrible kind of God as well as a loving God. And
well, interestingly, are you guys familiar with Sethian cosmology?
No. Sethian?
No.
Yeah, Sethian.
Right. So never heard of it. Never heard of it.
Is an early Christian cosmology.
Oh, wow.
And I found it fascinating. I thought this makes a lot of sense. It was advocated by some of the Gnostic Christians, the Marcions in particular.
Yeah.
And it's mentioned in the Gospel of Judas, which of course didn't make their final cut for obvious reasons. So what they believed was that Jesus is not, well, basically they believe that the Old Testament God is an evil God, and he's not the ultimate God. The ultimate God is unknowable, unnamed, and he comes from this place called the immortal, well, I shouldn't say place because it's a purely spiritual realm as I understand it, called the eternal or immortal realm of Barbelo. And Judas knows that Jesus is from this realm. He's come to sort of liberate us from the evil demigod called Salas. And Salas is the evil god that created the world. And he created the world because here in the physical realm of existence, you can have pain and suffering. So, so it was a bad thing to create the world, right? And Judas believes, is from this immortal realm of Barbelo and has come to liberate us from this sort of physical suffering. So the God of the Old Testament in the Sethian cosmology is considered evil.
Interesting.
This would be far more consistent with all the animal suffering that we see. You know, why is it that God kills all the animals? Why did he send the flood? Why the 10 plagues? Well, because he's evil.
Well, Marcion would say that, So,
exactly.
So people did see it, and they sort of didn't have the blinkers that modern apologists seem to have on reading it.
I mean, my guess as to why you have this Marcion Sethian view is because they learn about the sort of turn the other cheek, you know, nice stuff in the New Testament. Went, oh, that's all good. I'm going to follow that. Then they read the Old Testament and go, whoa, what the hell's going on here? How do we explain this? Well, maybe it's because
they didn't have Bill Craig.
They didn't have Bill Craig, and they went, maybe the God of the Old Testament is just evil.
Exactly. And I've got one book of a liberal Christian that says that not evil. He just says maybe he's just really rough and loving, and we just have to accept it. And I thought, gosh, this is being honest. He's not being theological. He's just being honest with what we read, you know?
Yeah. Although, I mean, how loving can you be when you're that rough?
Well, that's true. That's where you start to then have issues even with that. You know, so very interesting to bring it back to the theology like that, because a lot of Christians are going to have to really think on this.
They have, and they've started, you know, actually a lot of papers have come out with theists trying to come up with defenses, and they've come up with other ones, you know, like the second fall and animal heaven, and we can go into those if you want. But I don't think any of them work, obviously.
Yeah.
It makes me laugh because
it's theism, of course, is a big one. That would be maybe the most, I'd take a guess that might be the most popular response.
I'm just thinking of like God giving out the Bible, and he's just going to say, I just need to warn you, you're going to need a lot of work to defend what I'm writing here. A lot of work. It's going to take thousands of years, and you're just going to have to really work hard, because this is the Bible you're getting, you know? And because this is a big one, really big one, I see in theology.
I think it's the biggest problem that the Christians have.
Yeah.
Because it really blows out of the water the standard argument that most Christians think, which is the fool created the suffering, and we're responsible. But that just cannot be if you accept, you know, hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering. You know, it just cannot work. I mean, unless you try and come up. I mean, do you want to go over some of the other escape?
Yep, great.
Yes. Escape routes.
So I think
is that in your paper?
No. So our paper, if we want to talk about our paper,
well, I'd like to sort of
where do you want to go?
Scour the paper for every nugget going.
Okay.
And then we'll move on to that one.
So our paper is pretty much scientific. So it doesn't really talk about the theology. Initially, we had written it talking about theology, and then we just decided let's get the science out there first, and then we can revisit the theology, and that's the sort of the plan. So basically, one of the biggest problems. So basically, why do we think that prefrontal cortex is not relevant? How do we know that animals feel pain? So let's talk about the prefrontal cortex. Not only do we have sort of Roger as this sort of proof that the prefrontal cortex is not essential, we also went and examined why people thought it was essential for pain. So Murray did not make the argument that the prefrontal cortex was necessary for self-awareness. As far as I know, he never mentioned that. What he said was that it was necessary for pain affect. So let's just remind ourselves, affect is the emotional component of pain. Now, why did he conclude this? He got this from studies of lobotomy patients that had the prefrontal cortex disconnected. And the claim was that they could feel pain, but it no longer bothered them. They didn't mind it. And that's quite a strange claim. And if true, you know, that might give some credence to what he was saying. But notice, of course, that in order for them to report that they are in pain, or that they're in pain, but they're not bothered by it, they would have to be self-aware, right? You couldn't say, yeah, I'm feeling this pain, but it doesn't really bother me. That's a self-aware being saying that. So straight away, that completely contradicts what Craig was saying. But that's not necessarily a problem for Murray, although it is a bit of a shame that Murray has never condemned Craig on this. But anyway, what we did was go over all the case reports from the lobotomy patients. And what we found was that the lobotomy patients didn't say that their pain no longer bothers them. That's just not true. What actually was the case was that it was their anxiety about their pain that was relieved by the lobotomy, not their pain in itself. So if you imagine you feel some pain, you might start to worry, what does this pain mean for, the course of my disease or whatever, and so that is what was relieved. But their sort of the chronic pain was relieved. That's sort of long-term pain. But acute pain, which is sort of short-term pain, that was not relieved. In fact, it was worse than before. So I'll just quote you what some of the papers said. So Freeman and Watts were some of the people most associated with doing lobotomy. And they said, quote, prefrontal lobotomy, as observed in many cases of mental disorder, abolishes concern with the future. The lobotomy does not relieve the pain, but rather disabling reaction to pain, the fear of pain. So this makes sense because we think that actually these frontal cortices are about impulse control, about memories and planning for the future. So that would mean that if you don't have these, you're more living in the present. But that doesn't mean you don't feel pain, so they basically just completely misinterpreted this. The other thing that they appeal to is something called Blindside. So Blindside is a phenomena where a person says that they cannot see, but they're still able to respond to visual stimuli better than sort of what you would expect on average. And so the argument was, well, okay, maybe animal pain is like Blindside, that they respond to it, but they don't actually, they're not consciously aware of it. Now, we thought this was completely important. What we found actually was that what's actually seems to be going on with Blindside is that there's actually two visual pathways. One is called the retinal thalamal cortical pathway, and that is what supports sort of most of vision. But there's this other pathway called the retinal tectal pathway, and think of that as giving sort of very low level visual information, like sort of changes in contrast, motion, stuff like that. So that might manifest. So imagine that bit of visual information is going down one pathway, and the sort of other more obvious things are going down the other pathway. So imagine that obvious pathway is disabled. The other one, though, is not disabled. So it might manifest as sort of subtle intuitions, we think. And so it's not that they're not conscious of it. They still feel it, but it just manifests in a more subtle way. So what that means is that Blindside is not really an example of someone having a sort of type of consciousness that enables them to react to things, but without feeling it. That's not really what's going on. Moreover, animals also experience Blindside. So if their whole world is sort of in the Blindside world, as it were, their blind experience, then you would never be able to distinguish between a Blindside animal and a non-Blindside animal, because they'd effectively be the same. But obviously we can. We know
how do you distinguish between them?
It's from their behaviour, basically. Basically a Blindside person only reacts to things when given a sort of what's called a forced choice discrimination task. In their normal day-to-day, they're not motivated by visual stimuli. Whereas animals are motivated by painful stimuli, right? So this argument just doesn't work. But basically, in fact, there's a quote from William Lane Craig where he says you wouldn't take a Blindside person to an art gallery. They wouldn't get anything out of it, right? Because they're not motivated by visual stimuli. They're not going to give up a resource to pay to go to see, the latest, Van Gogh or Dali or Escher exhibit, because they're not getting anything from visual experience. Obviously, animals we know do give up resources to avoid pain or to consume analgesics. So that just doesn't make sense if Blindside is an analogy for pain.
And in the case of animals and going down the Michael Murray path and not having anxiety, one of the ways I would have thought that you can tell that an animal has suffered pain is their behaviour when it's what's the name of that chap who Pavlovian behaviour. Right. If there's something that precedes pain, then they come to expect pain. Then they will exhibit behaviour before they feel the pain, which is pain avoidance behaviour. So that suggests that it's not all in the present, that they do have they have a memory of it, they have an understanding of it, and they are planning. They're anxious about it and planning for the future to try and avoid it.
Correct. Yeah. And also what's interesting about Pavlovian behavior is, so some people would like to say that animals, are a bit more like what Descartes thought, more automatons, and, it's all conditioning rather than experience. But the problem is, how is this conditioning supposed to work, right? What is it about the reward and the punishment that creates the conditioning? Well, if we assume that they have experiences and emotions, then we can understand how the conditioning actually works. But if we think they don't have any experience, it's very hard to understand how the conditioning is supposed to operate. What's the mechanism to make the conditioning work? But also, I think we're very good at evidence that animals can think about the future. and the past. I mean, squirrels cache their acorns and so on. I mean, there's all kinds of bits of evidence.
Yeah.
Crows have been known to react differently to people who have treated them badly years and years later. But even if they don't, if you have an experience of pain that's purely sort of in the present, as it were, well, that's pain, that's suffering. I don't think that it even matters, whether you have a long-term memory of it or not.
I think I was only really putting that forward as kind of a rebuttal or a potential rebuttal to what William Lane Craig and to some extent Michael Murray are saying about it being completely divorced from from having the anxiety about pain.
But I think we have to distinguish. So that quote about the anxiety of pain was the thing about the prefrontal cortex, and the statement was more about how you view the implications of your pain for your future. So the idea of the prefrontal cortex, of the lobotomy, was to reduce people who were people who had excessive anxiety. So they gave this to those people to reduce that excessive anxiety. And it did work for that. I mean, for all the problems of lobotomy, we don't do it now, for good reason. And it can have some very negative side effects in some cases. But even if you reduce that anxiety, what can happen is, what was seen was that your acute pain, which is the more sudden pain, actually was worse. So there's no statement that you can make that these people didn't experience pain and suffering. Right. So therefore, the whole argument just doesn't work.
Yeah, distinguishing pain and suffering, what Francis was saying seems to make it quite clear that if you imagine a dog that is beaten regularly with a particular stick used for nothing else, and then you pick up the stick and approach the dog will be suffering. Yeah. In that situation.
Oh yeah, they'll feel fear for sure.
And it will be very apparent in their behaviour.
Yeah, in fact, what's very interesting, I think, is that you can actually stimulate a fear response purely electrically. Now, where do you do that? It's not in the prefrontal cortex. You do it in subcortical regions of the brain. And if you do that in people, they will suddenly say, I feel afraid and I do not know why. If you do it in animals, they'll show you a fear response. And now what's really interesting about this is that you can do this experiment on animals and give them control of the stimulus, and they will always switch that stimulus off, which is telling you not only are they having an experience, but they're having an experience they don't like, which is pretty much the definition of suffering. So they're just, and because that is subcortical, that tells you that you can completely reverse Bill Craig's argument. He's basically saying, well, because suffering needs a bit of the brain that only humans have, then this problem of suffering goes away. Well, actually, it's a bit of the brain that almost all animals have, so therefore the problem is not going away, it's magnified.
It's not looking good, is it?
No, it isn't.
Well, it's looking good for us from our atheistic perspective.
Throwing in a Bible verse about animals, Phil, there is this throwaway comment from Paul that I'm sure you must have heard in this sort of thing, which is it sort of says he's talking about the law of Moses. You shall not muzzle the ox while it's threshing. God is not concerned about oxen, is he? And so has that ever been used in terms of like a throwaway comment on Paul?
So I've debated a few people on this topic, Michael Murray. I mean, I've done a few of these debates and obviously many chats. And that quote has never come to me.
Right. Okay. I mean, it's just a throwaway comment. It's like it's not. God is not really concerned with oxen as such. It's really this. Basically, these laws are meant for us, and in some sort of metaphorical way. And that oxen he doesn't care about. It's just like it's interesting to try and get in the mindset of even Paul here on what about animals, because he probably would be quite shocked to think this issue has come right up as a big one. Yeah. I mean, theologically.
It is strange. Like today in the West, we're suddenly starting to see a much more concern for animals.
Absolutely.
Other religious traditions have had this for thousands of years. The Jains believed, you shouldn't harm animals. and they're very ancient. So why it wasn't a concern in Christianity, I do not know.
Well, possibly. I mean, Ed, do you remember you were at Greenbelt? Did you ever come across Greenbelt Festival, which is, for Phil, if you don't know, is a very liberal sort of Christian festival. They had a stall there that was all sort of for animal rights and animal this and animal the other, and somebody was hosting it, and I went up and I said, you know, how do you square this with so much of animal suffering like in the Bible? And she really had no answer. She wanted to go away and find someone to say something. And because she was sort of, it was all pro where we are today with our eco-consciousness and veganism, which is fine. But it was like she had no awareness, seemed to me, of anything. It was like, of course, God would want all of this. But actually, as you probably discovered, you know, you can make a very good case for eating meat and almost the disregard of animals in much of the Bible. And so it's like, it's really funny how the church seems to go the way of the general consciousness of the world and try to drag the Bible to it, to catch up. That's my feeling.
Yeah, it's funny. Whenever I get Jehovah's Witnesses knocking on the door and I immediately raise this topic with them, they always say, "Let me go away and find someone who can."
Yes, that's right. Let me go and say, "Oh, I didn't realize." No, it's nice to go to some passages.
If you could bottle that response, Phil, you make $1 million.
Right.
And yet, Christians often, when a non-Christian or atheist or agnostic says, "I don't know, I need to think about this more," they go, "Well, you see, we do know, you know." But then when it's the other way round, you know, they don't really know how to answer.
Well, it's also interestingly, you know, when Justin wrote his book, you know, you had him on last episode, I believe, and I was really interested. You know, he hosted me on the show to talk about animal suffering. And I just think it's the strongest argument against the existence of God. So when I read his book, I was really intrigued to see what he would say about it. And you know what he said about it?
Nothing at all, as far as I can remember.
Correct. Nothing at all.
Nothing at all.
Didn't even mention it, you know. And the book was supposed to be, I mean, I don't want to have a go at Justin because like all the Christians having this problem, but, you know, just a little bit, but the book was supposed to be, you know, after 10 years of talking to atheists, why I'm still a Christian. It's like, so you should presumably get the best arguments that you've heard from atheists over the years and respond to them. And it's felt to me like, well, maybe he didn't think it was the best argument. That's fair enough. You know, I think it is. And he didn't respond to it. And of course, most Christians don't. It just doesn't, well, I mean, many of them, it doesn't even get on their radar. But I think as people are becoming more in tune with animal rights, then it's going to become more on their radar and they're going to have to face this more and more.
Yeah.
And if we all become, you know, vegetarians or vegans, which I think will happen, actually, I think, all right, here's my guess as to the future. We are going to get synthetic meat and people will not eat real animals anymore. And then it will become more and more the case that it would be seen as eating animals will be seen as wrong. I mean, some people think that today. I do, yes. You know, but most don't. But, you know, but I think when the technology develops, then the morality will evolve with it. And then when you get to a point that everyone doesn't eat meat, it will be very easy for them to conclude that eating meat is wrong. And then Christians are going to have a big, not just Christians, I should say, you know, other religions that endorse eating meat are going to have a really, really big problem.
Phil, I'm going to say, no, they won't. What they will say, this is what Christians will say. They will say, Christians were always in the forefront of arguing for veganism. Yes. And you can trace this in the Bible. You can see throughout the Bible that God is working his way towards, although it was imperfect, it wasn't perfect. There were a few, you know, glitches where he had to make allowances for our human nature, but it was, you can always see it's all part of God's plan. And if it hadn't been for Christians pushing forward this morality, we wouldn't all be vegans today. That's what they'll say. That's how they do it.
They'll have a hard time saying that to a Jane.
Well, I'm afraid Janes are just not sufficiently numerous to make much of an impact on the debate. But
no, they will.
I take your point. I take your point on
that. No, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. They will say
they will do that.
But I think you have seen, as we've become more sympathetic to gay rights, what we have seen is that the church has had a bigger problem. Yes, they can make their arguments and so on, but the fact that people are more and more sympathetic to equal rights for gay people has caused a headache for the church, and
Definitely.
it has caused their numbers to go down, I believe. And I think the same will happen with animals. And it's
I think that's Phil. I think that's the way it'll go. I don't go for Francis' way, or not for 100 years or more.
Because, no, it's a long way into the future. It's a long. These things I think take time to become so normalized that people can't remember a time when it was
like slavery now.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And there was a point where we weren't at all where we were in the church over slavery, and now you have to do your defending. When we get to this stage on slavery now within the church is mind, you have to defend what the Bible says, but to get to the stage where we are. But you didn't have to do that back in the past,
right?
I just see identity things being wound up in this massively. So you're a good Christian meat eater, and these evil atheists, Impossible Burger people.
You can see in America, it would be Democrats who are becoming vegans and Republicans strong meat eaters.
Well, you're already seeing some things like I believe some Republicans have suggested that they shouldn't be allowed to sell veggie burgers because it's misleading people to say it's a burger. And so you can see that they're fighting back against the non-consumption of meat, that they are having problems. So it's getting to be an issue in their face, whereas several decades ago they wouldn't have had to worry about this. This wouldn't even be on their radar.
That's interesting. Wow.
Now, I had in mind that we would invite Phil back to sort of start with a clean sheet of paper, arguing for vegetarianism.
Variants.
And so I don't want to sort of ruin that show by covering too much of that material. But I guess most listeners would have thought, until this discussion we just had, that it was the elephant in the room that we were avoiding. And actually, it sort of was, but because we want to have another whole...
Well, yeah, we could do that. I mean, one thing I would recommend, one of the things that persuaded me to become a vegetarian was reading Robert Nozick's book, Anarchy, State and Utopia. And that, interestingly, is a book by a political economic philosopher who was advocating libertarianism, very low taxes and minimal government and so on. So I was expecting to be reading about that. But if I remember rightly, I don't know if it was the first one or two chapters, was all about saying why we shouldn't be eating meat. And the arguments were amazing, like really powerful. And we can do that show. But in the absence of that, definitely people should read that.
Okay.
Gosh. You know what they're going to do, though, Phil? They're going to go back to the early parts of Genesis and say, look, right at the beginning, it said that, it was the plant that was given for man. And there's no hint of...
No, they have already. So we haven't really come over. I don't know how much time we have left. We haven't really gone over some of the other alternative defenses that people have used.
Yeah.
Against this argument.
Well, that's the young Earth view. That the vegetarianism was the beginning.
Yeah, that is one view.
And at the fall,
that we were already supposed to be vegetarians, and that it was the fall that sort of made us.
That's right. You will be a young Earth creationist yet, Phil. I can see it coming. Because they do argue for vegetarianism.
The problem with young Earth creationism is
the science.
It's the science. It's not the theology bit. The theology bit
I think
it makes sense.
I think theology makes a lot more sense in young Earthism. I've always said so. It's just that there's crazy science, which means that it's wrong.
Unfortunately, the science is against them. Yeah.
Unfortunately, the way the world is and pure science.
But the problem is, don't forget, as we said before, the problem here is that God does his own animal suffering activity, the flood.
Yes.
The 10 plagues. I mean, just think about that. The first plague was turning the water into blood. All the fish died.
Yeah.
Right. The last plague was not just the firstborn children. It was
the firstborn creatures.
Yeah. So even if you take this young Earth view that we were supposed to be vegetarians, then that doesn't get you off the hook.
Well, it's worse than that, because when we looked at in the Old Testament, the possibility that Yahweh did command the sacrifice of firstborn humans, but gave a law to substitute it for sacrificing an animal. In the way that we're going with this talk, actually, the sacrificing of the animal is still cruel.
Well, right. I mean, think of Abraham, right? The great mercy was that God
put a lamb.
Said, we don't have to kill your son. I don't mind. We'll do the mock execution of your own son, if that's not torture by itself.
Yes.
but it's okay. You can sacrifice the lamb to me.
Yeah, which was caught in a thicket, by the way, a bit like that trapped animal. In the
right.
story,
I mean, we were on holiday in Namibia, and we saw what animal was it? A springbok trapped in a fence. What did we do? I mean, I'm not trying to blow my own trumpet here, but I just think most people would do this today. We got out the car and we freed it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not what God did.
You don't say, right, come here, we're going to sacrifice it to
let's sacrifice it and to God.
Well, I watched on YouTube I couldn't watch it actually. I started to watch it. It was because sometimes we hear about sacrifices in the Old Testament of animals, and you tend to, it's very easy to sort of see it in the distance and in the past and kind of like, okay, that's what they did to talk about God's love and goodness knows what was going on. But I saw a modern day Jewish bringing of an animal to be sacrificed today in the culture today. Like they do it once a year or something, and I was horrified. I couldn't watch it.
I'm not aware that that's part of any Jewish practice that I'm aware of.
Oh right, okay. I'll send you the link that I saw. That it was some kind of thing where they had this animal, and they didn't actually. They were taking it, and they were all coming around it. Apparently, it was some kind of thing today with an animal, and I was horrified at watching it. So I'll try and look that up for you.
Do. But I mean, obviously, the instinct here is to just say, look, that's wrong. Killing the lamb is also wrong. It might not be as bad as killing the child. I'm sure it isn't. I'll be honest. Even though I'm a vegetarian, I would sooner a lamb is killed than a child. But that doesn't mean killing the lamb is okay.
Particularly the theology of sacrifice in its place, sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, this brings us to a different issue. Actually, I want to raise this. Yeah. Is that so? My moral instincts say all this stuff in the Bible is morally wrong. Now, that has an implication for the moral argument, because in order for the Christian to come back, they've got to tell me that my moral instincts are unreliable. Yes. Now, if my moral instincts are unreliable, then what basis do I have for saying that morality is objective? Because when someone like Bill Craig or Justin Briley or whoever it is, whatever apologist you want to name, says, morality is objective, that all these things are wrong. What are they doing? They're appealing to the reliability of your moral instincts. But if I do that, then I must say that the God of the Bible is not real. The only way for me to not say that is to say, well, I can't trust my moral instincts. But if I can't trust my moral instincts, then I've got no basis for saying the morality is subjective.
Yeah.
And also, it cuts off your ability to act morally in the world.
Correct.
Which is something we've discussed.
Yeah. Right. And also notice the example that they give whenever they say, morality is objective, is torturing children for fun, right? That's the example they always give, right? Is that the ones you get when you...
babies, yeah.
Right, torturing babies. Now, if babies, they don't have a developed prefrontal cortex, so what's the difference, right? I mean, they also don't pass the mirror test, for self-awareness. So if anybody doesn't know, that's a standard test to see if an animal is self-aware or not. I also can't ask a baby whether it's in pain. So if we're going with a sort of Callum Miller argument, well, we can't know. Well, I can't know that babies are in pain. For whatever reason you've got for thinking animals can't feel pain, you should probably apply to babies. And then where's your moral argument?
Yeah.
Why not? Notice that they don't give as an example torturing animals, because God does that.
If you turn it on its head, though, say with Callum and all these people, once you get, but what you're trying to do, I suppose, Phil, is to say, look, all the evidence is pointing this way, and they're in a situation of, oh my gosh, I feel that, say, God given what they would call absolute morality, that this is wrong, animal suffering is wrong. Oh my gosh, God has made it this way, and that's the problem, isn't it? Once you admit, they can't get themselves to admit that it's wrong.
Yeah.
And so they have to go the defense line. But actually, their very own moral objective views, when they admit that you're right, means that they are wrong, in a sense. You see what I mean? That God is either not good then, basically. That's what it's going to. It's not that he doesn't exist.
Yeah. I mean, of course, one of the other arguments they would give, not the people that we've talked about, but other theologians, one of the most popular ones is the skeptical theism argument, where they'll say, okay, we just can't know why God allows this, but we believe that God is good. And so we have to believe that he has a good reason. We just don't know what it is. But again, the problem of animal suffering really undermines this, because for the flood, for the plagues, he gives his reasons. He explains why he's doing it, right? So it's not as if there's this mysterious reason that we just don't know. He spells it out. He's doing the flood because man sinned. He says that explicitly. Same with the plagues. He's doing it to show off his power to the Egyptians. Right. So you just can't run so many of these standard theodicies and defenses just get deflected when you as soon as you start thinking about the animal suffering.
But wait a minute, you've used the Old Testament to debunk them, but some theists will try to sort of what they call classic theism and try to divorce it all from Christianity. So you wouldn't, that approach wouldn't work. You'd have to have your own way of pushing back against that without appealing to the Old Testament.
Well, are you saying, Ed, those that don't accept the Old Testament as being true or moral? I mean, there's the Marcion. We talked about that earlier. There are the Marcions who took that view, but I don't believe, to my knowledge, there's no Marcions around today.
Well, the greenbelty people that Andrew was talking to, they're all inspired by the love of God as seen in the life of Jesus.
They go to the early parts. They do some Bible passages.
Well, okay, but let's go to the New Testament then. Let's give some examples from the New Testament. Let's talk about the story of Legion. In the story of Legion, there's a man, if I remember rightly, a man possessed by a demon. Jesus expels the demon from the man and puts the demon into 2,000 pigs, which then run down a hill and are all drowned. Now, why did Jesus do that? Why didn't he just expel the demon and not put it in the pigs? Also, when Jesus doesn't seem to have any problem with fishing. Fishing is reasonably cruel activity, I think. And also, Jesus, when he comes back, eats meat in the,
Yeah.
So if he's in this now divine sort of body, representing the new heaven, or the new earth, or whatever it is, he's still eating meat, So I don't think, even if you want to sort of divorce the Old Testament, you're still going to have plenty of problems. Yeah,
Ezekiel's prediction of the future temple, as far as he's concerned, this massive thing still unveiled sort of sacrifices of animals, and that was the wonderful future. But there are other verses that there's always in the Bible. We've always known this, haven't we? That there's other verses that sort of counter other verses. It's not just all one way. And have you not come across the fascinating passage in Jonah? Which talks about, I think Jonah is complaining about the plant or whatever. And he goes, then the Lord said, you had compassion on the plant for which you did not work, which you did not cause to grow, which came up overnight and perished overnight. Should I not also have compassion on Nineveh, the great city in which there are more than 120,000 people who do not know the difference between their right hand and left, as well as many animals? And so there's one verse there that you can use for compassion on animals.
Yeah, no, I think there are others as well. I mean, the most famous one would be the lamb and the lion will lie together in the new heaven,
not eat
the new earth. Sorry. But there's no question you will find,
and this is the thing with the Bible. It's rich, isn't it, in stuff?
Because presumably the Bible wasn't written by a single author.
That's right. This was someone else who was thinking God had compassion on the people and animals,
or even if it was the same author. Sometimes they're in a good charitable mood, and sometimes they're in a bad mood.
Yes, moody God.
Well, it's the big old book of multiple choice, isn't it?
It is. That's
the Bible.
Right. Yeah. That's right. So you can always string your dots together.
But that's going to make it difficult, even more difficult, because if you believe animals don't suffer, then what's the advantage of the lamb lying down with the lion? They were already in a state without suffering. So you're not, you can appeal to these passages, but what you're doing, if you talk about passages which show compassion to animals in the Bible, is showing that animals should have compassion showed to them. Yes, and therefore the parts God. Where they don't is showing up God even more, because it's an internal inconsistency. You can always attack an argument by saying, I don't agree with your assumptions, but if your own theology is internally inconsistent, then you're really going to have a problem. So, the neo-Cartesians of the world, sure, they can say animals don't suffer, or we don't know that they suffer, and then you can try and defeat this problem of animal suffering. But if your own Bible says that they do suffer, then you can't even run that argument.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Really interesting. Fascinating stuff.
Okay, we're running out of time. How about animal resurrection?
Oh yeah, so this has been advanced by people like Trent Doherty recently. And so he thinks that animals not only resurrected, they're transformed into people.
Into people?
Really? Wow.
Oh,
wow.
Yeah.
Never heard that.
Well, whether it's literally
I've never heard that.
When I say people, what I mean is beings that have the sort of same sort of cognitive capacities as us.
Wow.
Because what he thinks is that animals need to get sort of cognitive capacity so they could appreciate the role that they've played in God's grand design. So I think
gosh, that's fascinating.
I mean, if one is, how far-fetched is this that literally a cat is going to turn into a person? I mean, that's one of the things. How many crazy things do you have to believe to be
I've heard of many people that have thought animals will be resurrected. In fact, I'm pretty sure a major person in one of my churches was advocating that.
Right. The problem is
that's just animals coming back.
But it's just your pets, is it, or the whole lot?
I don't know, because it'd be interesting. Who wants some of those vipers coming back? I mean,
yeah, I mean, poisonous animals as well. Are they going to be in the new?
But that means it's automatic salvation for animals, and why would all animals be saved in that way, and humans not? It's just it raises so many.
Well, I think
problems.
one of the problems. I mean, there's various versions of the afterlife argument. So one is that it's a compensation. That's not what Prefrontal endorses, by the way.
Okay, right.
But some people do. So let's just address that. The problem with compensation argument is that generally compensation is given to someone wronged, and you might ask, well, I mean, all right, let's give an example. Let's suppose a company poisons a river and people around the river are harmed.
Yeah.
So then the company compensates them, and you might even get enough compensation that you actually would sooner have the poisoning, than not have had it, because the compensation is more than whatever the cost was. But then you could ask the question, why didn't the company just give them the compensation anyway without the poisoning? And now there's an obvious answer, because the company has limited resources and it's not just going to hand out money left, right, and center. But God doesn't have limited resources, right? So he can give that compensation without any suffering. So therefore, the suffering is still unexplained. So if you're thinking of afterlife as a compensation, then, I just don't see how it works. And I think now Trent Doherty doesn't think it's compensation, but he thinks it's a sort of necessary part of the great design that God has. And animals will appreciate their role in it when they're transformed into people. And I mean, I just find this completely implausible that they would do so. But also, most Christians wouldn't accept it. So there's a problem there that's the case. But even if they did, the problem is, why couldn't they have that appreciation of God's grand design without going through the pain and suffering? Because presumably some animals go through less suffering than others, right? So some you get to live a long life with, little injury and so on. And others, I mean, some when they're killed are killed quickly and others slowly, right? So why is it, if the ones that are killed quickly or not killed at all, or have a long life rather than a short life, or don't lose a child, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Presumably they can also experience God's great design of nature without the suffering. And therefore it seems to be the suffering is still unnecessary.
Yeah. I think many people listening to this
argument.
So Phil, you're going to tell us next that animals have souls, and there's some soul-making version of. There is a soul-making argument. Yeah,
yes,
and that was advanced by Richard Swinburne.
Yeah,
he sort of said, animal soul-making is the answer. But I will take you straight back to the tar pit. Right, you're stuck in a tar pit as an animal, and you're going to starve to death. Where's your opportunity for soul-making there? I don't see one. You can't do anything. It's not like you can show great courage and, save another animal, which is sort of the sort of thing Swinburne talks about. That's just, there might be cases where an animal can show nobility, in the face of some suffering. But in the most part, no. They're just eaten alive or starved to death.
Yeah.
And also, let's put it this way. Would you put your own children through this soul-making development? I don't think.
Yes, give them some horrible parasite that will eat them from the inside.
Right. Would you say, I'd be happy to put my child through that because they'll make their souls? No, of course you wouldn't. And in fact, you would do everything you can to relieve them of such suffering. And that's one of the contradictions I find in Christian theology is that, and in fact, it's in Justin's chapter on suffering. He said that, suffering can lead to our moral development and it can get us closer to God. But he also then says, but notice also Christians are the ones relieving suffering. They're out there
unraveling God's plan.
Yeah. I've always thought
there's a real contradiction there because if suffering is going to get you closer to God,
yes,
you shouldn't relieve it.
Yes. Yes, and God's frustrated. Will you stop doing that? So it does seem like that when the contradictions come about.
Stop with your hospitals and your nurses and your police force and your fire brigade.
Yes, that's right.
Charitable acts. These people were suffering, getting closer to me.
Yes,
you've mucked it all up.
And don't worry about the animals because they're just going to be resurrected. Could be a way to people would eventually think if that's the case for animals. And so, it's all right, they'll be resurrected. And so that could even breed bad treatment, or allow it, that kind of thought. Sounds a crazy one, doesn't it? Resurrection of animals.
And not just resurrection, but resurrection so that they are literally talking, thinking.
Wow.
I mean, I do think animals do communicate and they do think, but not in the same way that humans do. But what Doherty's
I suppose it's
like Narnia.
Yes, I know. That's crazy.
It's presumably similar to what Christians must think about children who die, very young.
That's true. If you're a fetus, what do you suddenly appear as the 30-year-old or something?
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's a real problem for the soul-making theodicy because, if you need to go through the suffering to develop your soul.
Yes.
What happened to the children that died? Did they not go to heaven? Because remember Bill Craig when he talked about the Canaanites that were all killed, he said, don't worry about the children. They're all in heaven.
Yeah.
Well, but hang on, they didn't get a chance to go through the soul making.
Yeah.
Well, I think
that means the soul making is not necessary.
I think it's Robert White who we had on this show. One of his, I think it was him who said about William Lane Craig that who I think he knows to some extent. He says, I keep meaning to ask him, how does that work with children who die when they're very young? I mean, do they all pitch up in heaven and they're like these sort of really superficial, glib people in the afterlife because they never developed a soul?
Start talking to them and there's just a vacant look because they haven't experienced anything. That's right.
And also, Andrew, you'll know this from the fostering training we've done and everything, that if you have a child who is seriously abused, they grow up to become much more likely to be criminals or terrible parents and all that sort of thing. Yeah. So their soul is unmade through their suffering, which is completely, they're completely innocent. There's no fault of theirs. How they've been
and the troubles stay with them and everything.
Yeah.
Soul making is really soul destroying in a metaphorical
sense.
Yeah,
exactly.
So I mean,
there's a great quote I remember from a Holocaust survivor, and they said, "What did it teach you?" He said, "Unfortunately, one of the things that the Holocaust taught us was it taught us to hate."
There you go. And
so no, suffering is not always soul making.
But even in the Holocaust situation, if you think about it, with Christian theology, say that the Jews weren't saved people, and how could say God had the Nazis treated them that way, and God went, okay, say with the humans we have this sort of thing that you're talking about, animals, which is sort of compensation. How do you square compensation of Auschwitz Jewish people gassed with not receiving Christ as savior in traditional theology? Right. How do you do it? You say, well, okay, anybody that's treated badly bypasses salvation that way because you're going to get compensated for your suffering. So it doesn't even work that way.
Right. Very good point.
It doesn't work that way because you think, well, humans need to go through Christ. Animals just have to be treated badly, and you think, well, why couldn't it have been like that with everyone? So anyway, yes, we're sort of pulling it all apart, aren't we?
Indeed.
I think we're pretty well reached our limit, haven't we?
Yeah, we're suffering here.
Going on too long. Can I just plug my YouTube channel? That if you go on it, there's mostly known for cosmology videos, but if you go on the playlist, go on animal videos, and you'll see some of the debates I've done, so you can actually see what the Christians are saying in response. Obviously, we're sort of talking to them behind their back, but you can see what they say, and click on the playlist animal videos, and you'll see what happens.
And I suppose there's a range that you've had, like ones that just sound like to you like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is so like just not.
Yeah, I mean, some are more reasonable. That I did a discussion with like John Ferrer, who's a Texas apologist, and that was a bit more difficult to hear than like Randall Rouser, who's someone I respect quite a lot.
Difference in caliber, maybe.
Maybe.
Well, Rouser's just much more. He's an honest broker.
So.
He's a good bloke.
Yeah, he spoke up against Ravi before anyone else was, you know.
Yeah, that's right. And got a lot of stick for it.
Loads of stick for it. He was persecuted almost.
Yeah.
So I had a discussion with him, and that is, so if you want to see like the theologian that I probably respect the most and how he responds, have a look at that.
Wow. Well, this has been an amazing news topic, and I think anyone listening to this is going to go away with a sort of a headache, but full of interest, hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah.
Because it's such a new issue that people have to be aware of in as society is moving on like this, biblically as well. So, any final thoughts there, Ed? Right.
Well, just Phil, that's just absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. We've got
thanks, Phil.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
It's been great. Okay, then, That's Loud listeners. Until next time, we're coming back to you with another interesting subject. I've been Andrew, your host.
And I've been Francis.
And I'm Ed.
And I've been Phil, your guest.
Cheers.
Bye.